I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just introduce myself real quickly. My name's Julie Slacum, and I'm a supervisory endangered species biologist with the Chesapeake Bay Field Office in Maryland. I'm also the service species lead for spotted turtle. And I've spent most of my career working on turtles. It's definitely a passion of mine. I've worked close to 2 decades on the federally listed bog turtle, so I'm really excited to be the species lead for spotted turtle. Christine McHugh from Science Applications, who most of you probably already know, is going to help me present today. But before we start, I just want to thank everyone for taking time today. I know how busy everybody is with telework, but I just want to thank everybody for your interest in learning more about spotted turtles and what you can do to help conserve them. So I'll just quickly go over what we're going to talk about today. So I'll provide some background on why the species is a service priority at-risk species, and then I'll talk about the distribution and status of the species. I'll provide a description of the species and information on its life history and habitat, and then I'll go into the threats it faces, and then opportunities for conservation through the different service programs to help address those threats. And then I'll talk about challenges that we have related to working on turtles in general, and some of the tools that Science Applications has to address those challenges. And I just wanted to say that this presentation really is geared towards the Fish and Wildlife Service. I know that there's probably some of our partners out there that are tuning in today. I still think this will be helpful for folks in that it'll give you a better sense of what the service can bring through our different programs and grant programs to help meet conservation needs for the species. So I wanted to provide a little background on why spotted turtles was chosen to be a service at-risk species. And a big part of that is that the service was petitioned in 2011 to list the species under the Endangered Species Act. And when we went through our national listing work plan schedule, essentially what the service did is put the species into different bins, and this species is what we call a bin 4 species. And those are species that have significant conservation efforts underway that will help address threats and hopefully help us improve the status of the species. So like some of the other species like salt marsh sparrow and wood turtle and Chesapeake log perch, we have until 2023 to make a listing decision. And the great thing about that is it really provides us additional time to better understand what actions, what activities, and what programs effectively address the threats to the species. But it also gives us extra time to implement those actions with the states and all of our partners. So spotted turtles, they're definitely a wider ranging species. They have a very large range, starting in Maine, spanning all the way down to northern Florida. And in that area, they're found mostly on the Atlantic coastal plain, but they can also be found in the Piedmont physiographic region. And then the arrows on this slide, it just shows that the species can also be found on some of the islands, some of the coastal islands. And then you can see that they also occupy parts of the Great Lakes region, and that includes parts of Canada and the United States. So this is a species that was really thought to be quite common, and I think literature describes it as probably one of the most common species in Massachusetts and back in historical times. But in recent decades, we've seen some precipitous declines in numbers, and it's really mainly due to habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, which is similar with a lot of our other turtle species. But because of that, because of these precipitous declines that we've been observing over the last couple of decades, all 21 states in which the species is found, all of those states have listed it as a species of greatest conservation need. So in their wildlife action plans, they have actions identified, and they are definitely, monitoring to see, what's going on with the species. It's also designated as critically imperiled and imperiled in Quebec and Ontario in Canada, and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature considers the species endangered. And then I also wanted to note, because of the illegal trade, which I'll talk about more in this presentation, it is listed as an Appendix 2 species under CITES. So like the bog turtle, this is a really small turtle species, and it actually can be confused with the bog turtle in geographic areas where the two have an overlapping range. I know I've confused the two, earlier in my career. And mainly it's because as the adults age, they lose the yellow spots that you see in the upper picture in this slide. So adults reach about 3.5 to 4.5 inches in length. The biggest, as I said, the spots are really the biggest identifier for this species. So, they have a smooth black carapace, and you'll see scattered scattered yellow spots, and you also see that on their head and neck, and that's on the top shell. And then the bottom shell, they typically have a tan to yellow plastron, which has large brown to black patches. And again, as adults age, those patches can get bigger. And then the males typically have brown eyes and a brown jaw, and they have a long, thick tail. And then they have a slightly concave plastron, and that's for mating. And then the females have orange eyes and an orange jaw and a flat plastron, and their tail is shorter than the males. And oftentimes the adult females are larger than the males. And then the hatchlings, you'll see one yellow spot on each scute or plate. And I just wanted the bottom picture, again, just sort of gets at the small size of this turtle. That's a Blanding's turtle shell that it's next to. So it just shows the marked difference in the size. So like most other turtle species, spotted turtles are long-lived species. They can live up to 26 to 50 years. That's about the average. I'm sure there's some older individuals out there. They do have delayed sexual maturity at about 7 to 10 years of age. And like other turtles, they have really high egg and hatchling mortality, but they have high adult survivorship. So because of this, keeping adults in the population is extremely, extremely important, especially females. And, the other part of that is because they have such a low reproductive effort. So typically they only have one clutch per year with like 3 to 5 eggs. Down south, they may have more than one clutch, but commonly it's one clutch per year that they have. But they do reproduce throughout their life. All right, so the habitat, so they are found in a wide range of wetland habitats. So shallow water bodies with emergent vegetation. So we can find them in marshes, vernal pools, wet meadows, swamps, ponds, slow-moving streams and rivers, and ditches. And they use these aquatic water bodies for overwintering, feeding, mating, and basking. And then they typically hibernate under shrub or tree roots in wetlands or vernal pools. But this species will use terrestrial habitat. Once they come out of hibernation, they will travel to different wetlands to bask and to forage. They'll also use terrestrial habitat for nesting. And then they'll use terrestrial habitat or wetland habitat for summer estivation. They do have a small home range, so dispersal is pretty limited. And when I say small home range, it's several hundred meters that they'll typically travel between the different wetland habitats and the terrestrial habitat. And this turtle is definitely a turtle that emerges earlier than most of the other turtles. They can deal with the lower temperatures a little bit better. So monitoring usually happens pretty early, much earlier than the other species. They'll come out in like late winter, early spring, and they're the most active in the spring. As the temperatures increase, they'll go into estivation. So I just wanted to show some pictures of nesting habitat. So nesting occurs late May to early July. And they'll use wetland habitat, similar habitat to bog turtles, in that they'll use the tussock sedge and sphagnum moss. As long as they have good solar exposure and there's not a risk of flooding, they do okay, and that's probably a better habitat to avoid predators, which I'll talk about. And then the top picture shows more of like a terrestrial environment. So they'll use fields, they'll use meadows, which potentially could have grazing animals in it. They'll use edges of roads and right-of-way. And obviously, when they use those habitat types like roads and near agricultural fields, the female adults are at much higher risk of being crushed by agricultural equipment or, being run over by a vehicle. And they're also at increased risk of predation, the nests. So I talked a little bit about some of the threats already, but road mortality is a big one, predation on nests and hatchlings and juveniles. Illegal trade is a big one, and then, as I mentioned earlier, habitat loss and habitat degradation is definitely a big factor because it does isolate populations, and when you have a species that doesn't disperse very far, that can definitely create issues. So last year, the states of Maine through Florida started developing a status assessment and conservation plan for the spotted turtle through a Service Competitive State Wildlife Grant. This is really exciting that we have that many states involved. It's really going to help me when I have to do the species status assessment. That will be a big piece of information to support that effort. So as part of the CompSWG, essentially a standardized monitoring protocol was developed to help the states quantify the status and distribution of the species. And I just want to note that many of our refuges have been doing this monitoring, which is really helpful. And then I also wanted to mention that Science Applications is funding the state of North Carolina to do surveys. We feel like that state's an important part of the range, and they weren't able to participate in the CompSWG. So that's going to really, fill a gap, with regard to information on the status. And then the other thing that the project's going to do is examine effects of habitat fragmentation and climate change on the species. And then they'll also collect genetic samples range-wide. And the genetic samples, it's going to help us look at the status, but it will also help us with the illegal trade side of things. And that it could help us in figuring out the outcome of confiscated individuals. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit later. So, so all of this information essentially is going to help us better understand the status of the species, and it's going to help prioritize habitat conservation and management. And really the states have the goal of maintaining populations at or above their current levels throughout the participating states, and to achieve zero net loss of suitable habitat at high priority sites. And on our at-risk species SharePoint site, we do have we have information on the standardized monitoring and this CompSWG project. So if you're interested in doing that monitoring, you can look there, or you can contact me. So as part of that competitive state wildlife grant, a symposium was held last November in West Virginia, and it included spotted turtle, wood turtle, and Blanding's turtle. We had huge attendance. We had over 130 turtle conservationists from 78 institutions, and folks gave presentations on research and management. And then we also had breakout sessions on conservation needs and information gaps for each of the species, which was really helpful. And then based on what we got out of those breakout groups, we sent out a post-symposium survey to prioritize threats and conservation actions. And we had a really good response for that too. Over 30 states provided input, and 4 Canadian provinces responded. So for spotted turtle, the top 3 threats that were identified were habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and illegal collection. And then the top 3 actions were land protection, addressing illegal collection, and then a tie for road mortality and land management. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is go over those actions and how I think the service could contribute to working with our partners to address those conservation needs. So for land protection, the programs we think that could be really helpful and already are being helpful include refuges, coastal partners, and wildlife and sport restoration. And I thought I wanted to sort of mention several years back, we worked with Natural Resources Conservation Service to develop the Working Lands for Wildlife Northeast Turtles Initiative. And this initiative does include spotted turtle, and it includes the states of Maine through New York. We've been a little slow going with the program, but we're going to try to work with NRCS and the states to kind of evaluate to see how things are going, see if we can, address some challenges and try to make the program better. And if we can do that, there's the potential we could expand that to additional states, particularly for spotted turtle, because it has such a wide range. But I think a key piece is sort of having the states develop that conservation plan through the competitive state wildlife grant, so we can better identify, where we would protect habitat and do restoration of habitat. But I think the Wetland Reserve Easement Program could be really huge for this species in protecting land. And, in New Hampshire, they've been really, really successful using WRE and protecting Blanding's turtle habitat. And I think we could replicate that with this species. But again, I think we need to do a little more work on seeing how the program's working and how we could improve it. So, and then I just wanted to mention, some other sources of land acquisition include coastal wetland grants, North American Wetland Conservation Act grants, Land and Water Conservation Fund, and then DOD land acquisition programs, which I think not a lot of folks know about that, but we've had a lot of success using what's called REPI, Readiness and Environmental Protection Integration Program, on the Delmarva. So, I think as I get time, we'll continue to sort of work with DOD to figure out where we could maybe use some of those programs where they have spotted turtles. So, for programs that we think could do land management or habitat management include refuges, partners, coastal, and the Conservation Planning Assistance Program through the Sykes Act, working on in-ramps, and then obviously the Competitive State Wildlife Grant, where they will be implementing some habitat management. And then I just wanted to note that we did develop conservation practices for working lands for wildlife. So I will add that to the SharePoint site where we have information for working lands for wildlife. And then we also worked with DOD to develop a best management practices document. We also have this for wood turtle if folks are interested. But this is something that when folks work with their DOD bases on in-ramps, it would be a good thing to bring up and not make sure, but see if they want to, include it in their in-ramp. But that document has some actions that I think would be helpful for landowners like refuges, but also for like Partners for Fish and Wildlife folks that work with private lands that have habitat that might have this species. So, those actions that were identified in the DOD document include controlling predators, and that's to increase recruitment, and then maintaining upland forested buffer habitat in travel areas. So it would be travel areas between wetlands and along streams, and again, that's to provide cover and protection to adult turtles, so that they're not crushed. Managing invasives to maintain hydrology of wetlands, preventing wetland habitat succession through mechanical thinning or fire, also to maintain hydrology, and then having targeted herbicide control if you can't do mechanical or fire. Retaining snags, logs, and rocks along the perimeter and inside wetlands, that provides basking and cover and hibernacula for the species. And then we want to avoid ditching and draining and drawdown of seasonal wetlands. That's obvious that, we don't want to affect the hydrology. And then we want to maintain or improve water quality by trying to reduce sediment, nutrients, chemicals, things of that nature. And then finally, we want to try to protect and maintain nesting habitats by avoiding things like mowing during the nesting season. So for the threat of road mortality, we do have Department of Transportation liaisons and ecological services in most of our states. And so I think that's definitely a program that could help with this. And we have a lot of work going on that's looking at hotspots for road mortality. I know they're looking at it through the Competitive State Wildlife Grant. There's a Regional Conservation Need Grant. And then there was a model that was recently developed by University of Massachusetts, which Christine will talk about a little bit later. But all of these tools will help identify hotspots. So, and then for illegal collection, this threat, I feel like there have been folks from almost every program that have been helping address this threat. It's been really, really great collaboration that's been occurring. And essentially, during the last several years, we've seen an uptick in the numbers of spotted turtles illegally collected, along with wood turtles and box turtles, all of the species in the Northeast where, you know, we are definitely concerned about declines. So our law enforcement has been doing incredible work. It's been really great working with them, but I also wanted to mention that in response to this threat, folks from different programs in the region have been actively engaged in a group that was formed in 2018 called the Collaborative to Combat Illegal Trade in Turtles. It's kind of a mouthful. And I think we have close to 10 folks from different programs participating in that group. And the groups, right now, the group's comprised of biologists, law enforcement. We have some legal and policy folks. We have some folks with zoos and aquariums. So definitely a diversity of knowledge and interests. So, so this group is really focused on the East Coast, but we're trying to develop tools that we hope can be applied nationally and have a national impact. And we recently had a call to action letter that went out on World Turtle Day, and these were some of the needs and actions that we pointed out and that the working group is trying to address. And the first one's coordinating state regulations. And an example of this is, I just saw a webinar last week. The state of South Carolina is actually trying to promulgate state regs because right now they have very few regulations that address essentially collection of wild turtles. So what's happening is, you know, the states are, the adjacent states have really strong regulations, so individuals are coming from those states and collecting in South Carolina, and I think they're definitely starting to see the impact of that. So that's what forced them to, you know, promulgate these regulations that are currently in their state legislature. But oftentimes we also talk about loopholes. So, you know, these criminals that are illegally collecting these turtles definitely know what loopholes are out there that can allow them not to get prosecuted for collecting wild turtles. And then another need is just gaining support for additional resources for law enforcement. And I don't think I need to say any more about that. You know, we know that we have many less people than we need to deal with, you know, all of the illegal activities that are occurring. And then we also, feel like we need to enhance public outreach, communicating the severity and the scale of the crisis. External Affairs has been extremely helpful with this. Bridget McDonald's put out some really wonderful articles, but we're just going to continue to put that information out there and try to get more and more public support because this just continues to be such a conservation issue. And then we're working to increase resources for emergency housing and care of confiscated turtles to relieve the strain on law enforcement. So there are times where law enforcement has to keep turtles in their office and kiddie pools. You know, if they don't have the capability to do that, you know, sometimes turtles aren't going to be able to be confiscated. And then in recent years, well, actually in like the last year, you know, we've had cases where there's been hundreds and hundreds of turtles that have been confiscated. And luckily the states have been able to help out, but it's definitely something that we need to increase resources to help law enforcement so that they can confiscate more turtles. And then finally, we're trying to implement science-based planning and decision-making to guide housing, care, and management, and then essentially the final outcome of these turtles after a case has been prosecuted. So a big question that we're wrestling with is, can we release them back to the wild after a case has been prosecuted? And I'm sure, as most of you know, disease and genetics are definitely an issue. So the more information we have from the cases, the better. Genetic information, it depends on the state, you know, how I guess comfortable they are with using genetic information. But the genetic information can be helpful. So if we don't repatriate back to the wild, you know, the other questions are, do we use those individuals for captive breeding? Do we use it for research, to test research questions? Do we use them for education? Or do we actually have to euthanize? Because these are long-lived species. So, you know, you have several hundred turtles at an institution. You know, can they afford to care for them for decades? So anyway, it's like I said, this has been just a really fascinating issue to work on, lots of really great cross-programmatic work. And I think, you know, we'll have a future webinar to talk about it because I think it would be great for folks to hear the law enforcement perspective, and then we can go into what's going on with outreach and then decision-making and things like that. So sorry, Christine, I'm kind of rambling on. So, but I will turn it over to you. Do you want me to stop sharing, or did we have questions while I was rambling on?
You're fine. No, there have not been any questions yet. But if you want to just click through the slides, that might be easiest since there's only a few more.
Okay, sure. Yeah, just tell me next, or.
Okay. So some of the potential challenges that we have for conservation for the species is that often spatial data can be difficult to obtain because, like Julie has just been talking about, the illegal trade is a serious threat to this species as well as other turtle species. So spatial data can be really sensitive because we obviously don't want that to be shared with folks that are involved in the illegal trade. So that's one challenge with trying to achieve conservation. Our relationship with state biologists is extremely important and is essential to really achieving the conservation that we need, especially considering, like some of the things Julie has pointed out, state regulations and rules are different across state lines, and we need to, as the Fish and Wildlife Service, maintain and also develop strong relationships that with the states throughout the range and the state biologists who have the direct, intimate knowledge in their state and what's going on with those populations. There is some statewide atlas data available for different states in our region and also other regions, but it's not always available. But there is some statewide herpetology atlas data available for some of our states. And then working on refuge and Department of Defense lands is obviously one major opportunity that we can use in the Fish and Wildlife Service to further conservation for the species. We have a lot of refuges in our region that have spotted turtles and their habitat to be able to make real management decisions and actions on the land that we're already managing. And then also our relationship of defense and through the Sykes Act, like Julie said, there's some best management practices already established for spotted turtle and other turtles on those lands. And when we have the opportunity to engage with the Department of Defense on those lands, we can help try to use those best management practices. And that document that Julie referenced earlier that's on the SharePoint site also outlines some specific bases and locations throughout the region that we have known populations for. So if you haven't already seen that, make sure to take a look at it. And then we also have the habitat model that Julie mentioned earlier that the University of Massachusetts has helped us develop. If you want to go to the next slide, Julie, I'll talk about that a little more. So the University of Massachusetts, Science Applications has an ongoing relationship with their Designing Sustainable Landscapes, and they have multiple different models developed for a larger kind of suite of landscapes and species. For those that have heard of Nature's Network, this is one piece of that kind of larger project. And so there's a spotted turtle specific model that UMass developed. And these are the components that were included in that model. So there's habitat capability, which is, sort of like the classic suitability for the species. There's conservation cores, which are, large blocks of intact and high quality habitat. And then the level of connectivity between those cores. So how can they move from, different habitat blocks to others? And then the road mortality or road vulnerability. So where turtles are most likely to potentially be hit by cars as they're moving between those different conservation cores. So those are sort of the main components that have gone into this aspect of developing the landscape model for spotted turtle. If you want to go to the next slide. And so there's a lot more information about the model and the data that went into it on the UMass Designing Sustainable Landscape site. That's actually the link to like the broader information about designing sustainable landscapes and all of their models, including other species. And then there's some specific methods that were used to develop this tool for spotted turtle. And we can provide these links as a follow-up to the webinar and also on our SharePoint site, the at-risk species SharePoint site that we have internal to Fish and Wildlife. And if you would like the model data, again, because it's sensitive location information, it's not publicly available. So if you are interested in accessing the data, you can contact Renee Farnsworth, who is in Science Applications in the region as well, and we can provide that contact info as a follow-up also after the webinar. And next slide. And so that wraps up the presentation part of the webinar. And I do just want to say that we will send out a follow-up email with a lot of the materials and documents and links that we referenced that can be shared, but also for Fish and Wildlife staff that are on the webinar today, that at-risk SharePoint site has almost everything that we've talked about centralized on a turtle page there, but it's only accessible for Fish and Wildlife employees. So for our external partners, we will share the information via email to the publicly accessible information. And with that, we will open it up for questions. If you have a question, you can either type it into the chat box, or you can hit *6 on your phone to unmute and speak. Also in the chat box, Brad Compton, who is at UMass that worked on that spotted turtle model, provided his contact info and said that he would be very interested in talking more about it or any feedback from anyone that uses it. So we will also share Brad's contact info as a follow-up. Thanks, Brad. Any other questions before we wrap up? I will say that we did record this webinar, and as we've been doing with all of the at-risk webinars that we've hosted so far, they will be captioned and posted on our SharePoint site, and then we can share the YouTube link with our partners to the recorded webinar as well.
I guess that means I did a pretty good job.
You definitely did.
Well,
do you want to add anything else, Julie, before we wrap up?
I just want to say, if no one else has questions, if you think of any questions, you know, just feel free to contact me. I think Sonia might have just posted a question or comment.
Oh, yeah. So we just got a question. She said, do you have suggestions for actions that field offices can take to address the illegal collection issue?
I think, you know, at the field office level, I guess it's, you know, working with your state biologist to see if there's any needs within your state. You know, if folks are interested in joining the collaborative to combat illegal trade in turtles, I think, you know, the more folks involved, the better. I am chairing co-chairing the repatriation working group, and, you know, we can always use more folks in that working group. There's actually several different working groups, so research, outreach, grants. So there's a lot of opportunities, but I think outreach is big too. Just, you know, telling anybody you can that, you know, this is an issue. And I mean, even my daughter just, you know, was saying the other day that, you know, let's go to the park and, you know, go find a turtle and bring it back. And I was like, no, we can't do that. You know, they need to stay in their habitat. So I think a lot of it too is just education that, you know, these are really long-lived species with low reproductive output, you know, and high mortality, you know, of hatchlings. So it's really important to protect our adults.
Thanks, Julie. And I did just put in the chat if anyone's interested in getting more involved with the CCITT to contact us.
I don't know if I saw another comment come up, Christine.
That was just me telling people that they could contact us about the CCITT.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, if there's no further questions, Christine and I we want to thank you for taking time to join us today, and I hope the presentation was helpful, and I hope the different programs, can help engage in conservation of the species. So thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you all. Yeah, thanks, Julie, too, for presenting.
No problem.